Welcome everyone to this IES event, Unlocking Multifunctional Solutions for Climate Change and Biodiversity. This event has been organised by the Institution of Environmental Sciences Climate Action Community, and it will be chaired by a representative from the community who I'll introduce in a minute. The Climate Action Community champions a transformative approach to reshaping unsustainable systems, focused on addressing the interlinked challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. The community brings together environmental professionals from across specialisms to promote the work of experts and evidence around climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. I will share a link about the community in the chat shortly once we get started, just in case you're interested in finding out more. But to kick off properly, I'm really pleased to introduce our chair today, Akshatha Virendra. Acts as the head of sustainability at MZA, drawing on 2 decades of experience in energy and environmental management. Axe has delivered impactful sustainability strategies for landmark projects, including HS2, London City Airport, and significant government contracts such as the Ministry of Justice, with her sustainability projects earning multiple award nominations. Axe is also a member of the Climate Action Community Steering Group here at the IES. Thank you so much, Axe. I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Ethne. Good afternoon, all, and thank you all for joining us. Today, we are talking about 2 of the biggest threats facing our planet, that's climate change and loss of a natural world. So they aren't separate problems, they're deeply connected and make each other worse. Our expert panelists will help us understand this link and explore how we can tackle both challenges at once. So you'll be hearing from each of our expert panelists who will provide lightning presentations on this topic, and we will then have a panel discussion. So as part of this panel discussion, attendees can post their own questions to the panelists. So please type these into the Q&A box, which I'll read out on your behalf. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our panel of experts who are joining us today. So in no particular order, I'd like to invite Alison Smith, who is our Senior Research Associate at the University of Oxford. She works across the Environmental Change Institute, the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, and the Leverhulme Center for Nature Recovery. Having previously worked for over 15 years in climate and energy policy, she now has a strong interest in climate and nature policy. So she works with practitioners and policymakers to map and assess opportunities for nature recovery and nature-based solutions. She also models the impacts of different land use strategies on climate and nature goals. So I'm so pleased to welcome Alison. Alison, would you like to say a quick hello to our audience today?
Hi, yes, thank you for the introduction. I'm really looking forward to this session. Climate and nature links is a very strong interest of mine.
Thanks, Alison. That's great. We next have David Tudor. I'd like to welcome David, who is a Director of Ocean and Coastal Futures. He is a leading expert in marine and coastal environments with over 3 decades of global experience. He's a co-founder of Ocean and Coastal Futures, chair of Wales Coast and Seas Partnership, the host of Blue Finance 2025, a trustee for Rewilding Britain and WWT, and a vice chair for Pembrokeshire Coastal Forum. He has also founded Pelagos, an organization. Thank you, David. So I'd like to welcome you, but could you please say a hello to our audience?
Hello, thank you for that great welcome. And yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about the marine environment. As you heard from my introduction, I'm very much focused on the ocean and coastal area.
Thank you, David. I'd like to welcome Mark Southwood next, who's founded the Temple Group. It's an environmental and planning consultancy in 1997, and he has over 35 years experience working in environmental and sustainability sector. In 2018, Mark set up the Southwood Foundation, which is now a registered charity, convening action around climate change and biodiversity through nature recovery and restoration. Mark, welcome, and would you like to say hello?
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to this session like the others. Obviously a very important topic. I will be talking about the topic from the point of view of the Southwood Foundation and the sort of active steps that we're taking.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. Thank you very much.
Okay, no problem. Bye.
And we next have Linsey Mortimer, who is a principal nature and climate consultant at Frontiera. It's an environmental geospatial consultancy which supports financial institutions and corporations to assess nature and climate-related issues. She's also a sustainability specialist at Green Arc Consulting, advising clients on ESG strategy and net zero planning. She has 7 years of experience in consulting and investment management industries. Linsey, would you like to say a hello to our audience? Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, and hi everyone. Yeah, very much looking forward to the panel session, and I'll be presenting on the importance of location-based assessments for climate and nature and how we can use satellite data to do integrated assessments of both.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'd like to welcome all of our panelists and audiences. Thank you for joining us. And over to our speakers now for their lightning presentations.
Great. Good. So I'm going to focus on the role of nature-based solutions for addressing climate and biodiversity challenges simultaneously. So nature-based solutions involve working with nature to address societal challenges. And the key thing is that by definition, they have benefits for both people and biodiversity. And they involve protecting, restoring, or sustainably managing a wide range of ecosystems, including woodlands, hedgerows, agroforestry, peatland, and also the other ecosystems that don't typically receive so much attention, like grassland, shrubland, heathland, and wetlands. And then also urban green infrastructure, such as parks, street trees, and green roofs. And in farmland areas, agroecological measures like using cover crops, minimum tillage, or adding organic matter to the soil. And then in marine and coastal areas, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about from David later on, things like restoring salt marshes, seagrass, and kelp beds. And there's plenty of good case studies of some of these examples on our website, which is the Nature-Based Solutions Knowledge Hub. And I've put a link at the bottom there, which I will be sharing these slides later if anybody wants to go and have a look. But not all nature-based interventions are nature-based solutions. For example, plantations of non-native species like Sitka spruce or biofuel crops like miscanthus grass are not normally nature-based solutions because although they may be needed for timber, fibre and fuel, they generally have little biodiversity value, unless, for example, they're being used to regenerate badly degraded land. And also trees in the wrong place, such as on species-rich grassland or peat, are also not nature-based solutions, because again, they can have adverse impacts on biodiversity. But nature-based solutions can address a wide range of climate change adaptation challenges, and at the same time, they'll also provide mitigation through carbon sequestration and storage. So coastal and marine nature-based solutions can not only protect against coastal flooding and erosion, but also provide food security by supporting commercial fish populations. Natural flood management measures like rural woodlands, leaky dams, floodplain reconnection, river restoration, etc., can not only tackle inland flooding and erosion, but also help to safeguard water supplies and protect water quality. And urban green and blue infrastructure can do both of those things and also protects against heat waves by helping to cool urban areas. And then agroecological measures such as agroforestry, hedgerows, etc., tackle floods and erosion and water supply and water quality and help to provide resilience against heat waves at the same time as supporting food security in a changing climate. And actually, when we looked at the most recent climate change risk assessment for the UK, done several years ago, we found that nature-based solutions could address 33 of the 34 risks where further action was needed, and all 8 of the top priority risks. I won't go through this in detail, but the top priority risks included risks to habitats and species, soil health, carbon stored in ecosystems, risks to farming and forestry, the risk of collapse of supply chains, the risks of power system failure, because nature-based solutions can protect infrastructure from flooding and erosion, for example, the risks from overheating through the urban green infrastructure, and also risks from impacts overseas by protecting those global supply chains. And when it comes to mitigation, the best estimate is that nature-based solutions could help to provide about 10 gigatons of CO2 per year in terms of either avoided emissions or enhanced carbon sinks, which is about a quarter of current global carbon emissions. And most of that comes from protecting intact ecosystems or managing working land, such as farmland and forests, more sustainably. Only 2 gigatons of that comes from restoring ecosystems. So there are limits to how much carbon we can soak up by planting more trees and so on. And really, we need to have a lot more emphasis on protecting what we've got already and reducing those emissions from farmland. Looking at just the UK, for example, we're currently storing 3,600 million tonnes of carbon in our soil and vegetation, which is equivalent to about 34 years of greenhouse gas emissions. Sequestration as a whole is currently negative overall because the emissions from degraded peat and arable land outweigh the sequestration from trees. And the nature-based solutions potential is significant, so it's about 3 years of emissions according to one estimate, but it clearly doesn't replace the need to cut fossil fuel emissions. Looking at Oxfordshire, for example, for a study that we did a few years ago, net sequestration from our current ecosystems is only about 8% of our current fossil fuel emissions across the county. But if you also look at what's stored in our soils and vegetation, that far outweighs the annual total emissions. So really, this is just emphasising that the carbon stored in ecosystems, we need to pay a lot more attention to protecting that. There are clear synergies between climate and nature. So in addition to the carbon storage and sequestration in soils and vegetation, agroecology can also reduce greenhouse gas emissions from fertiliser use by providing natural sources of nitrogen, and therefore you can reduce your synthetic fertiliser applications. Biosolar roofs can help to cool down the roof temperature, and that improves the efficiency of solar panels. For climate change adaptation, nature-based solutions can protect energy infrastructure from floods. Lots of coastal power stations, for example, are vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding. And also, biodiverse, healthy ecosystems are far more resilient to climate change. And if nature-based solutions are well designed, they can also deliver multiple benefits beyond climate. So not only the sort of carbon storage, flood control, erosion control, cooling and shading, but also other regulating services like regulating water quality, air quality, noise, and also providing pollination and pest control services, which contributes to provision of food, providing fresh water, and also the cultural benefits such as recreation and aesthetic value, education and knowledge, and a sense of place as well, which is hard to quantify, but very important. So one example here in Scotland at Eddleston Water, the Tweed Forum worked with local landowners here, and they planted 200 hectares of native trees, cross-slope hedgerows, created log barriers, wetlands and storage ponds, and re-meandered 3 kilometres of the river, which had been artificially straightened. And this helped to recreate gravel banks, riffles and pools in the river, which helped spawning salmon to arrive. The water framework directive status changed from bad to moderate, and also flood peaks were delayed by 4 hours and reduced by 30%, which protected 500 homes downstream from flooding and avoided almost £1 million in flood damage. But the wider benefits in terms of carbon storage, water quality, recreation and aesthetic value were worth over £4 million. But there can also be trade-offs between climate and biodiversity. So for example, constructing clean energy infrastructure such as wind and solar can cause direct damage to species and habitats. Some particular examples might be wind turbines on peat or in bird migration routes, solar farms on high-grade farmland, and also mining or deep sea mining to get critical metals needed for renewable energy infrastructure can also be highly damaging. When it comes to bioenergy and BECCS, so bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is a central plank of many climate strategies for removing emissions from the atmosphere, a lot of our wood pellets for BECCS, for the bioenergy plant at Drax, are imported from old growth forests in the US and Canada, which is a major problem. So a couple of examples here. So a paper a few years ago showed that if you put a wind farm on an undegraded peatland, you're actually going to get a net loss of carbon, which completely wipes out the benefit from having the wind farm. And for over-extracting biomass from woodlands, there is a risk here that our structurally complex natural woodlands, which have got ample nesting and hibernation sites for birds and mammals and invertebrates, can be subject to over-extraction of biomass for biofuel. There's this objective in the UK to bring all woodlands into active management, but that can actually have disastrous effects if it's overdone. So to manage these trade-offs, we need things like the more we reduce our demand for energy in the first place, the less of this energy infrastructure we need, so we can kind of offset damage in that way. It's also really important to make space for nature and carbon. So for example, dietary change, eating less meat, shifting to a more plant-based diet could free up a lot of farmland, where we can then devote to nature restoration and carbon storage. Also crucial to put the right things in the right places to avoid the most damaging impacts. And standards are really important in all this, not only standards for the infrastructure, but standards for the nature-based solutions themselves. So our key guidelines for nature-based solutions are that they're not a substitute for the rapid phase out of fossil fuels. They involve a wide range of ecosystems on land and at sea, so not just the usual suspects of trees and peat. Crucially, they need to be designed by or in partnership with local communities, so we can really take account of the local needs and constraints and priorities. And they need to be explicitly designed to support or enhance biodiversity. We can't just assume that anything nature-based is going to automatically have a biodiversity benefit. So some examples of this, standards for multifunctional sustainable drainage systems can ensure that they're not just an underground tank and a pipe, but they're actually overground systems with lots of benefits, not only for flood protection, but also for water quality, biodiversity and amenity. And looking at green roofs, well-designed green roofs like these ones, which meet the Green Roof Organisation standards, have multiple benefits, whereas a thin cedar mat, which are the mats that you just unroll onto your roof like a carpet, will have very little insulation or water attenuation and also little biodiversity benefit, and it won't be resilient to drought. So those standards are really important. And then for putting things in the right places, you can use opportunity maps like this one that we developed at the University of Oxford to show where in the landscape is suitable for different options like grassland, community orchards, agroforestry or wetlands. And that can also be combined with local nature recovery strategies. So it needs to be used as part of a participatory stakeholder engagement process with ground truthing and input from local experts. And the local nature recovery strategies, which are emerging across the whole of England now, are a crucial way of working out how to align your nature-based solutions in a way that they support local habitats and species and contribute to those networks that stakeholders have developed. So finally then, just to wrap up, my key points are that nature-based solutions have multiple benefits for climate, biodiversity, health and the economy. But really strong protection is needed for our existing carbon-rich ecosystems because there are limits to how much more carbon can be sequestered by creating new ecosystems. We need to make space for nature and carbon, for example, through dietary change or by having solar panels on rooftops rather than in solar farms. We need to restore a balanced mix of habitats, so not just trees and peat, but also grasslands, wetlands, shrublands, to support diverse native species in line with local nature recovery strategies. Put the right MBS in the right place and meet the right standards to deliver those multiple benefits. And also co-designing nature-based solutions to make use of stakeholders' local knowledge, views and values. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. We next have David.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen now. Okay. Thank you very much again for welcoming me here. My name is David Tudor. I'm the founder and director of Pelagios, which is an organisation that really works at the nexus between people and environment as advisors, and also Ocean and Coastal Futures, which is on a mission to improve sustainable management of our oceans. And we do that through convening, connecting and sharing knowledge. So today I'm going to talk about marine and coastal biodiversity loss, climate change and nature-based solutions. So really just to start off and just a little bit of background around the marine and coastal context really. So for the marine environment, you know, they're the forefront of global diversity, biodiversity crisis and climate change impacts. It's just been touched on in the last presentation really, but just to expand on that a little bit more. So these ecosystems are not only rich in biodiversity, but of course they are essential services such as climate regulation, food security, and obviously livelihoods for millions of people. And I think that intersection really of biodiversity loss and climate change in this area at the coastal zone and offshore really presents a complex challenge that requires some integrated solutions. So what I hope to talk to you about today really is the two issues of the interconnectedness of the nature-based solutions and the interconnectedness of nature and climate as well. So really the marine coastal environment is critical to the health of our planet, of course, really. It covers 70% of the Earth's surface, coastal zones, including mangroves and coral reefs and seagrass, and closer to home, salt marsh and oysters. These really play a vital role in supporting biodiversity, regulating climate, sustaining human livelihoods, and they're particularly vulnerable to human activities, And those activities, and we'll talk about them a little bit more, around pollution, habitat destruction in particular, around coastal development, overfishing, and all of these can exacerbate the effects of climate change. So really some of the challenges facing marine biodiversity. And just to touch on them there, as I said, there's significant threats to marine biodiversity due to the anthropogenic pressures listed on the screen there. Overfishing depletes the populations, disrupts food webs, habitat destruction from coastal development, and pollution degrades the critical ecosystem. And I think that increasing population and increasing coastal development is really key to all of this, where in certain areas of the world, mangroves and coral reefs are being destroyed. Then other areas, seagrass is being destroyed, and salt marsh really. And seagrass is particularly vulnerable, facing rapid decline in many regions, really sensitive to pollution. And that biodiversity loss not only affects the ecological balance, but really kind of undermines the resilience of ecosystems. And I think it's that importance of that, not just the loss, but the resilience that the coastal and marine environment gives. So really just showing that it's essential that protecting and restoring marine biodiversity is critical really for long-term sustainability. And just talking about some of the climate change impacts around the marine environment. So we've all heard about rising sea temperatures, and I think that's absolutely critical really, because that leads to certain areas of the world. We have certainly the shallower, clearer waters and the coral bleaching that's happened, particularly around the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. It alters the distributions of species, ocean acidification, as it's got there. Really, that impacts the shell-forming organisms and disrupts marine food chains. Sea level rise threats, as I've already mentioned, some of the loss of habitat at the coast. Well, sea level rise and that kind of coastal squeeze really increases the risk of flooding, where sea defences start to fail and nature starts to fail at the coast as well. And I think the intensity of storms and the frequency of storms, which we're all seeing really, is increasing, and that's causing further damage to ecosystems, but also human infrastructure, whether that be roads or towns or existing flood defences. And these all kind of challenge the ability of marine ecosystems to function effectively and highlight the need for adaptive and resilient marine management approaches. So some of the current status really, and just talking about a little bit around the global sense as well as more the UK position. So recent studies really have shown that 50% of marine populations have declined since the 70s. The Great Barrier Reef, as I've already mentioned, has lost half its coral since the mid-80s. WWF reported in its recent Living Planet report in 2024 really around a 73% decline in the average size of monitored wildlife populations over the past 50 years. But within that, the marine species have experienced a 56% decline. So I guess the key drivers for this, as I mentioned, around habitat destruction, climate change, invasive species also, that's something I didn't mention earlier. The invasive species is really key to all of this. But bringing it back closer to the UK, Ryan base, since the mid-19th century, native oyster populations have really just dramatically fallen by over 95%. Salt marshes around the coast, particularly in England, have declined by around 85%, and nearly half of the UK seagrass meadows have been lost since 1936. So they're pretty dramatic losses right across the centuries, really, going from a baseline of nowhere near where we are now, really. And as I said, those losses are really, I guess, symptomatic of the broader pressures, including climate change, pollution, and over exploitation. And as we've already heard really from Alison around the interconnectedness of the biodiversity loss and climate change, but that kind of amplifies really at the coast. The degraded ecosystems that we have, the degraded nature ecosystems that we have, are less capable of buffering climate-related disturbances, as I mentioned, sea level rise and storms. But also, conversely, climate change accelerates biodiversity loss by altering the habitats and increasing stress on species. So addressing these issues in isolation, so if you only address the climate issues or if you only address the biodiversity issues, doesn't work. You need to integrate those approaches really and to consider both to make any lasting change. And recognizing those those synergies between conservation and climate adaptation really can lead to those more effective and sustainable solutions. And just talking about some of those solutions, really, and I mentioned earlier around the loss from particularly sensitive habitats at the coast, such as mangroves and coral reefs, and trying to conserve those seagrass beds. And I think it is that conservation which is critical, protecting areas, but also trying to reduce the pressures on certain areas, whether that be from pollution, whether that be from localized issues around coastal development. But obviously, as there's some of those figures that I mentioned are so large that some of these habitats and species aren't going to recolonize or redistribute themselves or recover on their own. And hence, that's why you really need to intervene, and why humans need to intervene in restoring some of these habitats. And I think, to give you some examples really from the UK, there's been large scale salt marsh restoration. There's been a number of schemes for managed realignment, which is essentially letting the sea breach at the coast and then recreating large areas of salt marsh, such as over in Essex and in Somerset through the Sturt marshes there as a good example. Also, nature-based solutions such as sandscaping, which has deposited large volumes of sand and gravel on beaches. Instead of keeping on pouring concrete or keeping on trying to save coastal defence at the coast, using natural processes to help to do that. But also things like oyster beds in the Solent have been restored, and they continue to be restored as a nature-based solution. And things like that really help attenuate, to slow down the wave action and allow the coast to kind of recover. And just coming to a close really on all of this, the last couple of slides. So as I've said, nature-based solutions provide multiple benefits. They enhance biodiversity by restoring those habitats, but also, acting as coastal protection from these increased storm surges. But the other thing really is around the blue carbon habitats, such as salt marsh and seagrass and mangroves. They really do sequester carbon, lock it into the sediments beneath them, and they're a real kind of climate change boom there. And nature-based solutions also support local economies. For example, in seagrass and salt marsh, nursery areas for fisheries. So they help to keep those areas going for local economies, really. And really similar to what Alison said, I think that some of the changes that are needed, but some of the things that need to be implemented around this include things like community engagement. If you want to protect areas, or if you want to restore areas, then having community involvement is really key. But I think a piece of work that I've been involved with lately with Pelagios is not just about involving communities, it's allowing communities to lead, giving them the tools and the help they need to lead on some of the protection or some of the restoration around the coastal area in particular. And I think developing solutions that are resilient to climate change requires forward thinking, and I think those adaptive strategies are really key, and involving the local communities, involving changes in governance as well is really key as well. And this was discussed quite recently at a series of marine restoration webinars. There's the QR code there to watch those back, a piece of work that was done in collaboration with the Environment Agency and the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. And I think, just drawing to a close now, the local vulnerabilities and priorities is really key. I think it's really understanding the knowledge that sits in local communities is really important. Scaling some of the successful approaches that we found, some of the ones I've mentioned there. I think that policy support, the funding is really critical, not just from philanthropy, but from government, from corporates as well, to really accelerate the chance of biodiversity restoring. So I think, as I've said, really addressing biodiversity loss and climate change together is where you need to act. It's essential for the health of marine environments and the coastal environments as well. And these nature-based solutions really do offer a pathway to resilience, enhanced resilience, supporting biodiversity, and provide critical ecosystem services. But I think it's that design, the implementation, the community involvement, and sustained commitment and funding really is what is critical to all of this. And I think, just to give a plug, really, the QR code there is lots of these topics we've discussed at an event coming up soon. So please look out for that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's great. And thanks for the link for the webinars that everyone can watch. We next have Mark Southwood. Over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Just say a little bit, obviously, about the Southwood Foundation. Well, the slides come up on the deck there. We're basically about trying to accelerate action on climate change and nature recovery. And in doing so, the way we're doing that is connecting and convening with other professionals, corporates, communities. And I think a lot of what's been said by David and Alison resonates with me about bringing sustained action, understanding what's right for the local community, but this intrinsic link between climate and nature and doing the right stuff is so important. So thank you, Alison, David, for doing some of my work in terms of setting out some of the context, but we'll come to that shortly. So briefly, yeah, just I think if you flick on to the next slide. Yeah, I've just explained that one. So we run on, sorry, next one. Yeah, so again, this context has been set out quite well by others. I mean, I think the scale of the destruction in terms of nature needs to be properly understood. I think most of those on this call, I see over 40 of you on the call, so it's important that we do understand, as I said, the extent of the damage that is happening at the moment. And I don't know how close many of you are to that State of Nature report, but that has demonstrated that the abundance in the UK has declined 19% on average since 1970, and that's accelerating. And 1 in 6 of the UK species is now threatened with extinction. And that compares with 1 in 7 in 2019. So in short, we are creating huge problems for ourselves, and we really need to take some action. And it's important that action is intrinsically linked with things that we need to do around climate change, as I think others have explained. So next slide, please. So there are several shared drivers in terms of climate change, and it's about identifying the shared solutions. And again, I'm hoping that most of those on this call are familiar with the Lawton Principles, which does reflect this multifunctional approach and the need to think about things in a interrelated way. And that's both in terms of scale, connectedness, and creating, as I said, the right sort of change that we need. So, which will address both the what we need for climate and what we need for nature. So, next slide, please. So the Southwood Foundation actively supports the Lawton Principles. We've got a number of things that we're working on, and I'm going to talk about some of the practical ways that we're dealing with that. So I'm going to talk first to nature corridors, which some of you may or may not be aware of. I'm also going to talk about the Nature Action Hub, which we've set up, nature links, and also some land acquisition that we're hoping to do shortly. So on the first one, in terms of nature corridors, we're very heavily involved with the Wheel to Waves project, and you can look at that if you can Google Wheel to Waves, and you will see it's a fairly significant area. It's a 100-mile wildlife corridor that we're looking to create in West and East Sussex. The Southwood Foundation has been a strategic partner from the inception, and we're working with the Knepp Estate and Knepp Foundation on that. And for any of you who haven't been down to the Knepp Estate, I'd encourage you to do that. It's an extraordinary project. So the Wheel to Waves is about increasing the amount and the quality of land for recovery in terms of landscape recovery. And of course, in doing so, we're having to work with many local communities, community groups, and others, and landowners principally. But what we're looking to do is to demonstrate that we can establish these corridors, which are so important for nature to be viable. And we're looking to promote regenerative agricultural practices, and we're looking to learn from each other. We're also looking to reintroduce species, and One of the things that's happened at the Knepp estate is they have reintroduced some beavers, which of course bring their own solutions to flooding with some of their active work on dam control. So anyway, next slide, please. So I said there were a number of different things that we're trying to do. So that's one of the areas, the nature corridors, and we're hoping to demonstrate that principle. The next one is about Nature Action Hub, and the Nature Action Hub is about bringing expertise to local communities. I think as David was saying, it's so important, and I think Alison said the same thing, that we understand what needs to be done on the ground, and it's the local communities who understand what best is required. However, what they don't always have is all the relevant knowledge or expertise. So what we do is bring expertise to those local communities. And those experts come from our volunteer group, and we have volunteers from Temple, we have volunteers from Ramble, we also have volunteers from ERM, Rothamsted Institute. So we work with a wide number of people to bring the right sort of level of expertise. And it is about also upskilling some of those local communities in terms of their knowledge. So we've worked on something in the region of 30 or 40 projects over the last 3 or 4 years, and they vary in scale and size. Next slide, please. One of the other things we're doing is we've set up Nature Links, and Nature Links is all about providing or bringing different groups together, which wouldn't necessarily talk to each other about nature conservation and restoration. So an example of this is actually the golf sector, where we've brought together something in the region of 20 or 30 golf clubs to talk about what looks like good practice and to share some of the practice that is going on. So that has been very successful, and we're looking to broaden that now with other communities such as parish councils. Also, well, there's a whole range of different ones. Vineyards is another. So the idea with Nature Links is to intervene and bring groups together, as I said, so we can share best practice. Thank you. Next slide, please. Ultimately, one of the things we're looking to do is purchase some land, and what we want to do with that is to demonstrate what can be done in terms of regenerative farming, better models of how you can work with the local community to deliver change. We're looking to use these as sort of demonstration projects about what, as I said, can be the best examples. And we've already started that program, and we're looking to engage others in that. Next slide, please. So I think the other thing to say about all of this, of course, is we need to look beyond just the practical solutions, and it's important that we look at psychological and behavioural changes. And again, Alison and David have both talked to this a little bit. The net zero debate has become highly polarised and politically weaponised as well. And we do need to bring a lot more trust and avoid some of the cynicism in this space. So much of this is about us demonstrating what can be achieved with good practice. And we do need to work across the political spectrum to achieve some of this change. Nature has a very important role to play in galvanizing people into action. People are very aligned to a lot of what we are trying to do. Next slide, please. So, yeah, in closing, I just want to say, I mean, the Southwood Foundation is obviously taking some practical steps of how to bring change and work with local communities, but there's also a lot that's needed at the strategic level, at the policy level. We do work with others, such as the Aldersgate Group, Rothamsted, to become a voice for championing some of the change that's needed. And we have made contributions in terms of COP and also on domestic policy as well. We do look to be innovative in all that we do, and we're active in supporting a range of new initiatives, and one of those is on the rights of nature into the UK. And one of the first examples of that is actually on the River Ouse, where we're working with others on a charter for the River Ouse. So anyone who's interested in that, again, you can Google that to get some more information. And finally, I think we all need to recognise that there's a lot to still learn in these areas, but it is about having multifunctional solutions that are sustainable in the long term. And we are, as I said, we have to recognise, as I said, that we're in a rapidly changing system, both politically and dynamically, and we do need to create the right force for change. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was great.
Yeah.
And I'd like to next welcome Linsey to present. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that okay.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
So I'm just going to talk a bit more about how organisations can begin to understand climate and nature and actually respond to the risks and opportunities associated with climate change and biodiversity loss. Just a quick background on Frontiera. So we're an environmental geospatial consultancy, and we use geospatial data and satellite monitoring to analyse and evaluate climate and nature-related risks with a specific focus on biodiversity and deforestation. Since 2020, we've been working with financial institutions and corporations to understand their impacts and dependencies on climate and nature, ensuring they can comply and disclose with the latest sustainability regulations and frameworks, whilst also meeting consumer and shareholder expectations. Our approach is fundamentally based on geospatial or satellite-derived data to enable location-based assessments. We believe this is an imperative because climate and nature-related risks are highly location-specific. So traditional approaches often focus on reviewing broad industries or policies, which can miss critical nuances. As an example, if you imagine a sugar aggregator sourcing from 2 sugarcane plantations, you've got one in a drought-prone region, the other sits in an area with abundant water. Both farms are going to depend almost equally on water, but the risks that they face and pose to climate and nature are very different. So the farm in a water-stressed area presents much higher risk to the supply chain, the surrounding ecosystem, and the local communities. And if you suppose that one of the plantations borders a protected area, then the risk of environmental harm increases significantly. The operations could threaten the biodiversity of that protected zone. And these are the sort of crucial differences between locations, ecosystems, and risk profiles that just can't be captured without geospatial analysis. Now, a key issue that we've come across with our clients is the absence of location data. So many businesses and financial institutions have no idea where even all their operations are, and certainly not the full supply chain. In some sort of rare cases, our clients will have an established geospatial database for the entire value chain. For the majority of cases, we're working with them to map their portfolios or their operations and some of the supply chain as well. And this can be as simple as converting information they already have into geospatial files. So you might have a list of addresses, for instance. There can still be gaps, in which case we basically collect any internal data that they have and also use open source information to map as many locations as possible, and then create a sort of process in which you can add to this over time. For some complex value chains, like an equities portfolio, we've got a process where we are identifying high-risk industries, high-risk asset types as well, and then you can build a sample database of actual locations of concern. And it's not always fully comprehensive, but you can always obtain sufficient number of locations and develop a nature strategy and enable a better understanding and then reporting related to climate and nature. We've seen a shift over the last decade or so from climate-focused commitments and frameworks like the Paris Agreement, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD, and this has moved towards those focused on nature. So there was the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD. And the disclosure is also moving from voluntary to mandatory. So we probably already know a lot of climate-related reporting is now required through various sustainability regulations, sustainability accounting standards, including in the UK, in the EU, other nations. But the reporting frameworks are also converging. So many are partnering to drive consistency and encourage companies to integrate climate and nature into single processes. Although the climate and nature frameworks are starting to align, reporting and the assessment of climate and nature is still often done separately. So this is because climate reporting is more advanced, there are more tools and data and established practices. It has just been around for much longer and has been a priority for businesses and governments for longer than nature. What this means for nature is that the assessments are being driven by voluntary reporting frameworks like TNFD that I mentioned. They're often applying quite crude approaches to complex issues because many are relying on broad industry level screening, which can help flag general risks, but it falls short of enabling actionable insights. These approaches often miss key details like the specific location of your business or your supply chain, the strategy that you have or your policies, and it leads to an incomplete or misleading view of nature-related risks and climate-related risks as well. So how exactly does an integrated approach work? Well, for us, it means assessing both climate and nature using the same input and location data in the geospatial database that you've established. The outputs of the assessment can then be embedded into a single risk management framework so that insights from both climate and nature can be managed together rather than in siloed systems. And you can generate multiple reports, align with multiple standards from one assessment to support nature and climate disclosures, and crucially, the management of these risks that you uncover during the process. Looking ahead, we're also working to incorporate nature transition risks alongside those that we have for climate to better understand long-term risks and opportunities. In terms of the climate approach, we're talking about physical climate hazards, and not all reporting frameworks clearly define what these are. We follow the EU taxonomy. It's just one of the most comprehensive lists of hazards that you can get. The approach is to analyze the hazards using projected data across multiple scenarios and time periods. And for some specialized hazards, this can't be done as a sort of global coverage over every scenario, every time frame. So we use a logic-based risk assessment. As an example, for wildfire risk, we're using satellite drive maps of combustible vegetation alongside historical data on fires in proximity to the location that we're analysing. As well as this, not every hazard is going to be relevant to every asset type or the location. So a rise in marine water temperature isn't going to directly impact an onshore wind farm, as an example. We'll use either industry-specific or location-specific logic to include or exclude certain hazards. For each of these hazards, we also have specific ratings to determine whether the risk should be considered significant for the location you're analysing. So whether a change in freshwater temperature of 3 degrees over the next 50 years should be considered significant or negligible to ensure the results are going to be comprehensible and also actionable. This is just to illustrate some of the climate data that we're working with. So this is an example of temperature change out to 2060 under one of the more extreme climate scenarios. You can see the importance of location-based assessments for climate risk with significant variation in the projected temperatures globally. And on the chart on the right, you're seeing the change in temperatures across multiple decades and different climate change scenarios as well. So our approach to nature, it was initially developed through a number of pilot projects for the TNFD. And we leveraged the TNFD's LEAP approach, which consists of locating your interface with nature, evaluating dependencies and impacts on nature, assessing nature-related risks and opportunities, and then preparing to disclose and report these findings. While it's designed around this framework, the approach is aligned with other major nature-related standards. Since these are converging in both guidance and requirements, the results can support, and basically help organizations get ready for any future mandatory nature reporting. And just a few examples of some of the nature-related insights that we have. So we're conducting all of these within a platform and includes coverage of legal issues such as your proximity to protected areas, indigenous areas, water indicators like water pollution potential, water stress, also deforestation, whether you're operating in a deforestation front, or if there is forest loss within the location site or a boundary. So just on screen, you have a protected area at the top left. So that's the larger green polygon intersecting with a farm. Moving clockwise, forest loss is shown in red, and that's within the site boundary in the solid purple line, and also within a buffer zone around the site as well, just to show that you can understand what's happening within your operational site, but also in proximity to it. And then we're also understanding ecosystem condition indicators like biodiversity intactness, and also biodiversity hotspots globally. So every location is then analysed across the nature and climate related issues. And whilst these outputs can be interpreted individually, they're also combined into ratings, so you can understand your exposure to physical climate risk, nature-related issues, and also opportunities for nature-positive practices. So whether a site is maybe has quite degraded biodiversity, low mean species abundance, it could be a good contender for nature restoration, or on the other side, it could be up for protection of nature as well, if you wanted to implement that in your business. So just to sum up, we strongly believe that climate and nature should be assessed side by side. There's too much overlap to treat them in isolation. Water, for instance, which I've mentioned, is central to both climate impacts and ecosystem health. And by analysing both nature and climate risks together and harnessing the power of satellite-derived data to conduct location-based assessments, we're able to create a more integrated approach to risk identification and actually streamline reporting processes. So thank you very much for listening, and look forward to taking any questions in the panel, or you can contact me with the email on the screen.
Thank you, Linsey. That's great. Excellent. Thank you for all the panelists who presented very well. And I'd like to thank you all, and the insights you've provided are both inspiring and actionable. So you've given us a lot to think about as we move forward. So now we'll go into our panel discussion, and I'd like to remind all attendees to put your questions in the Q&A box. And if it's for a particular panelist, then please put their name down as well. So let's kick off our discussion. Let's go in the same order as we did before, if I may. So our first question would be, let's talk about the key barriers. So what are some of the key barriers in implementing solutions for both nature and climate? And is it a political will, funding, public awareness, or something else that you've experienced? Yep. So let's start with Alison.
Yeah, so we did a study of barriers a few years ago, specifically around barriers to climate change, adaptation, nature-based solutions. And they kind of fall into 5 groups, really. So there's obviously funding barriers, which, fairly crucial. And I think obviously that could be public or private funding, but in the UK, a large part of that at the moment comes from things like agro-environment funds. And clearly there is a bit of a problem in England at the moment with some of the agro-environment funding for farmers being suddenly withdrawn. The sustainable farming incentive was suddenly withdrawn at short notice a few months ago, which has kind of undermined confidence in that sector. So that's one aspect. And then there's also information barriers. So there's a really low awareness of nature-based solutions and what they can do. And many people by default will just head for like the engineered option, like, they'll build a flood barrier or an embankment because that's what they're familiar with and it's kind of baked into the system. So there's really a need for much more kind of case studies and demonstrations to kind of raise that awareness of the options around nature-based solutions. Then there was also some governance barriers. So I think various speakers, David and Mark have both kind of emphasised that like the strong local governance is really important, bringing in the community side of things, community engagement, because then you get much better ownership of the nature-based solutions, and they're likely to be much more long-lasting and much more appropriate to the location, and they'll really deliver those benefits. But often these are delivered by charities or small groups, and then they just don't have the funding to set in place a really strong governance system, especially if their nature-based solutions often span multiple organisations, multiple geographic boundaries. So that can be a real challenge as well. And then there's pressures on ecosystems themselves, as people have mentioned the vulnerabilities to pollution, habitat fragmentation, etc. So we need much stronger regulation to address those issues. And then finally, policy. So sometimes policies geared towards protecting nature can actually be misapplied to nature-based solutions themselves. So for example, seagrass restoration, and maybe David might have something to say on this. To get a license for restoring seagrass, you actually need to pay the same fees as a company that wants to dredge the seabed. Yeah, so I'll stop there and see what other people have to add to those barriers.
Thank you very much. And let's bring in David for his take on this.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, you've teed me up there, Alison. So, I mean, I agree with lots of what Alison has said, really, and I think obviously one is funding, but I think equally for the marine environment, there's funding, of course, is a challenge, let's say, but also the cost. The cost of working in the coastal zone, the cost of working offshore is much more increased than on land, obviously, and that brings with it difficulties. The difficulty of the environment, difficulty of operating in dangerous environments, difficulty of operating with water, all of that. So that kind of difficulty and cost, not just the funding. And then going back to Alison's point around the policy and the licensing. So I'm doing a piece of work at the moment, really. I'm working with government and funders and NGOs, and the phrase we use in challenge rather than the barrier. And I think that's really important because the licensing regime, the permitting, is there to protect the environment. It's very much there to stop somebody coming along doing something that's harmful. As Alison has said, sometimes the flexibility around applying this to nature-based solutions isn't quite there yet, but it's more assigned to stopping things happening that are harmful rather than encouraging things that have a benefit. And I think that nuance is really important. And then finally, really, I think that other point around locally led or local groups, and that the capacity there sometimes doesn't exist. Either it doesn't exist in the sense of the training doesn't exist, or the number of people doesn't exist. And then really that governance piece and legacy. I think that legacy is really important, where once the funding's gone, or once the NGO or whoever's come in to work in a locality leaves, how does it continue? How does the legacy of the project continue, really? And I think that is really critical as well, and embedding it locally in areas is really important to ensure the longevity of protection or restoration.
Yes, Mark, please go ahead.
Yeah, look, I agree with everything that's been said there by Alison and David. I think, there is this question about political will in terms of barriers and making it a priority. And I think, we have a problem in that department, without a doubt. I think we'd all recognise that. I think there is clearly the understanding that's needed about the climate change and nature-based solutions as being intrinsically linked. If we want to achieve a sustainable future, getting those things right, I think we are still learning in that space about what's right, what we can get done. I think there's huge barriers around collaboration and cooperation. I mean, one of the reasons I set up the Southwood Foundation is too many things being worked in isolation or in silos. So some great work being done, but not being shared. So again, we need to do better as an industry and as a community. So I think there is a huge amount that we can do in a practical way around some of those things. And I think, again, David and Alison pointed to that question of ownership and legacy in terms of and it's so important at the end to ensure that we have got some ownership, we're clear where that is, and we can hold people responsible around that. And as I said, I think some of these initiatives like the nature corridors could be hugely enabling and changing and bring the right outcomes. But again, it's about us being able to demonstrate that they do the right things. And as I said, rolling this out on a broader canvas. So, and how you scale these things is hugely difficult, both nationally and internationally, because often the solutions that we find in the UK will not be the right solutions elsewhere. So that's important to recognise as well, I think.
Thanks, Mark. And then Linsey.
Thanks. Yes, I think we did touch on funding already, but I think that coming from the private sector side, that in order to place more responsibility on businesses to fund nature-based solutions, they need to really understand how dependent they are on nature, on environmental assets and ecosystem services. And then what the associated risks are to the business in order to really elevate nature in terms of a more of a priority, I guess. Part of that also comes from regulation as well, from the governments. Obviously, climate has been prioritized for quite a while now and is only really just coming in as mandatory requirements there. But we do hope that nature-related disclosures will come into legislation much faster than climate did. Another one, I think Alison mentioned in her presentation about clean energy infrastructure being placed in certain locations which actually negatively impacts nature. I do think that conflict, I guess, I kind of mentioned already, but really prioritizing climate over nature and not understanding that they are linked and you can't have one without the other is really important. And that really comes back to understanding the specific location that you're working in and how nature is interacting with that infrastructure or whatever it is that you're looking at. So
thank you, Linsey. That's great. And yeah, really appreciate your views there. So let's move on to our next question, which is what strategies can we use to ensure that local communities, Indigenous people, and vulnerable groups benefit equitably and they're not excluded from decision making or resource access? Let's start with Alison, if I may.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not an expert on the social engagement side of things, but this is, as I think several of us have mentioned, absolutely critical to fully engage those local communities. And ideally, the NH-based solution should be community-led, or at least in strong partnership with local communities. In terms of the strategies to actually use, as I say, I'm not a social scientist, but there's no substitute for just getting in there on the ground. The traditional methods, focus groups, committees, like kind of forming local advisory groups and sort of project groups composed of all the relevant stakeholders, being careful not to exclude the more vulnerable and more marginalized groups as well within that process. So, it's not just local people, full stop, it's getting the full range of local people, including, different genders and low-income households, as well as the kind of the stronger voices within those local communities. But yeah, I mean, you'd need to talk to one of our social scientists to get the full in-depth picture on exactly what strategies to use. But yeah, it's just a case of really closely involving them throughout, right from the very start of the project, from the design all the way through to delivery, implementation, and then monitoring. Thank you, Alison. And David?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Alison. I think to add something to that, I think it is, as I mentioned just a minute ago, it's around kind of capacity, and I think I think what's really important for government, for funders, is that they help and assist the community-led process, because there's a lot of desire there, but it's equally difficult, as we've already said. It's difficult for everyone to protect areas or to conserve areas or to restore areas. So I think helping that capacity of communities that want to lead, I think, is really important. Now, whether that's changing the criteria for certain things, there's certain barriers to entry, whether it's organizations have to have a certain governance or certain amount of money before they can apply for funds, or pooling resources. That's another important thing around the ability of different communities to pool resources together, because they not every single community group has somebody who's an expert in finance or in licensing or communications. So that kind of, so really helping the capacity to build, I think, is really important. And for organizations that have funds or want restoration to happen, really prioritising the community-led element, really. And I'm not saying community-led is the complete answer. Of course, there's room there for governments, there's room there for government agencies, for corporates, for NGOs to help in nature's recovery, and they're the ones leading generally. But I think increasing the community-led aspect is really critical for the future.
Thank you, David. That's helpful. And Mark, please.
Yeah, I was going to say, building on what David said about building capacity, I think is hugely important here. And I think it's one of the things that we're trying to do as a Southwood Foundation is to build that capacity locally. And it is about sharing information across communities. So where projects have been done, a lot of communities do struggle in terms of in terms of getting the right sort of experts involved, I suppose. So bringing the right teams where you can draw on experience. And one of the things we've found with some local communities is by bringing them together, they've been felt far more emboldened and empowered in getting things done. So part of the sort of collaboration that we've been achieving has led to, as I said, people and communities feeling a lot more assured, I think, in terms of how they're going about things and reaching out to others. And I think as Alison already pointed to, there are trying to get to those hard to reach individuals is really difficult sometimes, and it requires a very bespoke approach. So I think one needs to be alive to that. But I think fundamentally, community-led is really important in terms of what you do on the ground. And as I said, it's for those communities to talk to others, in many cases, to help others to understand what some of the challenges are and how best to overcome those.
Thank you, Mark. Let's bring in Linsey for her take on this.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, so we do indicate, obviously if you're operating in or near a protected area, very likely to impact on biodiversity and nature, but also indigenous areas as well. So our clients are understanding exactly which areas they're perhaps operating in or sourcing from. I think that's an important starting point, just to understand how you might be impacting on local communities. Also for any of the more material risks, perhaps if you're operating in a very highly water stressed region, we'll always include recommendations for how to engage with the operator of assets, but also local communities as well, to ensure that there's a stakeholder engagement plan in place. I guess finally, I think we've already touched on capacity building, but I think that biodiversity loss, nature impacts and dependencies are all very complex, especially compared to, I think, climate change, which people have got a bit of a better grasp on now. And so we do encourage and conduct capacity building sessions just to help people understand what it is that they're dealing with and get that sort of foundational knowledge before they can implement some sort of nature strategy in the business as well.
Thank you, Linsey. Thanks very much. So that actually brings me to the next question, which was, how can we shift from a siloed approach where climate action and biodiversity conservation are treated as separate issues to a more integrated multifunctional one? So shall we start from Alison, or do you want to continue what you are saying, because it's related to that? Yeah, I'm happy for you to continue.
Oh yeah, of course. So I think that what we found is, like I say, the nature disclosure frameworks and risk management frameworks are more nascent, but a lot of our clients actually find that if they already have some sort of climate risk management system in place, nature can fit well into that. It doesn't require an entire overhaul of your systems. It just requires, some capacity building to understand what are environmental assets, ecosystem services, and then what risks and opportunities do those pose. And then you can, especially if you're conducting a location-based assessment, you might have been looking at climate more generally. Well, you can get some more insights into location-specific climate risks. and then set yourself up to disclose in line with the evolving nature-related frameworks as well. So yeah, I think that actually just understanding what risk management systems you already have in place and that nature can fit well into these as well.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you. Alison, over to you.
So this is about unsiloing nature and climate. Was that the question? Yes. Yeah. So I think a lot of it is to do, I mean, starting at the very top level with governments and international bodies not talking to each other enough. So I know there's a lot of emphasis now on getting the IPCC and IPBES groups working together, so the international committees on climate change and nature. There's a lot of emphasis on trying to get those two groups to work more closely together so that the climate recommendations don't end up having adverse impacts on nature. It's probably mostly in that direction rather than the other way around. And also within national governments. I mean, DESNZ obviously in the UK governs the climate side of things, whereas DEFRA, which is a much less powerful group politically, governs the nature side of things. So again, there's a need for much better integration there. And really, in terms of priority setting by the national government, our government is pretty good on climate, but not that great on nature at the moment. So I just don't think they see those interconnections in the way that the speakers here have described so powerfully how intimately connected those two aspects are. So I think it does need to start at government level with that recognition. And then at a more kind of project-based level, really, I guess it's just about giving people the tools, the kind of decision-making tools that give equal weight to those climate and nature aspects of projects. Often they are just very focused on one single project outcome, like flood protection or carbon storage or wood production, and they don't think about how do we maximize synergies for the other goals and minimize trade-offs. So I think multi-criteria decision-making tools can be quite helpful there, but also just general awareness raising, so people are much more aware of these interconnections.
Great, thank you. And David, please.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the last point is what I'd like to emphasize really is that it's almost raising awareness or educating, let's say, funders, for example, that not to put all their eggs in the climate basket, let's say, because I think, as I mentioned, if you've got a degraded ecosystem, they're less capable of buffering the climate related kind of disturbances. I talked about sea level rise and storms and that kind of thing. Well, if your ecosystem is degraded, then that doesn't buffer it quite as well. And then the other side of the coin is that climate change will accelerate the biodiversity loss. So I think they're so interconnected. We've talked about a lot on this call, but I think it's reinforcing that really and making it really explicit to policymakers, to funders as well. I think that's where the key lies.
Thank you, David. And Mark, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I agree again with all the others on this. I think at the government level, there needs to be much more collaboration across the various departments. I think, again, Alison spoke well about particular projects getting too outcome-led in terms of singular outcomes rather than thinking about the broader outcomes, and there are some unintended consequences clearly to some of these programs and projects. So it is about people having greater awareness of what those issues can be and to get that right as part of the original project design. I think some of the steps, as I said, are relatively easy in the sense of communities and others working together better. As I said, just some better collaboration. And one of the things we were working on was a sort of communities map of all the professional interested parties where there's shared interests around climate change and nature. And I think we can do a lot more in that regard. So I think there are some practical steps that can be taken, and we do need to take them fairly quickly, clearly. So yeah, nothing more to add really on that one.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
So thank you very much to all our panelists. Now we'll open this up to questions from our audience watching us today. Let's see what questions we have. Okay, so our first question today. Thanks to all the panelists, while noting that biodiversity is important in itself, can the panelists share their thoughts on how biodiversity can improve societal and economic outcomes? Any references appreciated, thanks. Who would like to take this? Alison, I see your hands raising.
Yeah, so we did actually produce a report on the economic outcomes of nature-based solutions a year or so ago, so I can provide a reference for that later on in the chat. But also there's been a lot of great work done by the Green Finance Institute, which some of the University of Oxford teams contribute to, showing the absolute dependence of economies on nature and the cost of inaction to restore nature. So I can also provide some links to those things as well. So I think basically what we found in terms of the economic outcomes of nature-based solutions is that they have quite a strong role to play in even in like short-term economic recovery from shocks. I mean, this was done in the aftermath of the COVID shock, for example, and they have lots of quite important aspects. So they can be kind of targeted to benefit communities where unemployment is a problem, for example. And often they can produce jobs which are quite highly skilled, but they can also produce jobs at the other end of the spectrum which are not particularly skilled. So you have that flexibility to employ a lot of different people with different levels of qualification and skill. And then, of course, as well as they deliver the multiple benefits, which kind of strengthen the whole sort of sustainable development outcomes across the board, improving human health, as well as protecting from the cost of climate damage. So there's quite a lot of sort of evidence that this can be there can be strong economic benefits, but there can also be some trade-offs. I mean, one of the obvious ones is with food production. If you're restoring land for nature and for nature-based solutions, you might lose productive agricultural land. So it's really important, as I mentioned before, to get the right things in the right place to avoid loss of the highest grade farmland, for example. And we also found that the benefits are much more strongly guaranteed if they're delivered in partnership with local communities. And if you don't do that, that's when you get the socioeconomic trade-offs. You get people losing out. Especially the more vulnerable groups. So that community side of things just becomes ever more important.
Thank you, Alison. That's great. So we'll move on to the next question. I'm just conscious of time. So we've got a question for Linsey. How do you ground truth the geospatial data for use?
Yes, okay. So I would clarify that our assessment is to be used as a prioritization tool, essentially, and to enable businesses and financial institutions to begin reporting on climate and nature-related issues. So it's a way to assess broadly your portfolio or your supply chain, and then find the sites which are most exposed to physical climate hazards or at risk of impacting negatively on nature, or perhaps I also mentioned nature-related opportunities as well. It's not a way to replace on-site assessments, but in order to assess, your entire operations and supply chain with on-site assessments, it would be extremely costly, and it's just not viable for many businesses, and certainly not for financial institutions which invest in thousands and thousands of companies. I would say, so we're indicating which sites you should prioritize for engagement with on-site personnel in order to verify any risks or opportunities that we're identifying. We are working on a new solution for monitoring afforestation and reforestation projects, which again, we would be developing a model which checks for those things and measures those things, and then verifying it, ground truthing it as well. So yes, it's not to replace that process, but it's a way for most businesses to be able to do that initial check and reporting, and then prioritize where to visit their operations or on-site checks with their suppliers.
Thank you, Linsey. So we have a next question, which is, how do we address the silo aspect of sustainability and policy? For example, how can we integrate more nature-based solutions that incorporate both land-based and marine aspects? David, would you like to take this?
Yeah, I think it's increasingly important that we get away from these silos. I'm a marine scientist by training, and there's so many people that have been trained in a certain area, whether that's kind of freshwater environments or marine environments, and they just stick to what they've got. And I think that's kind of estuarine, riverine, marine environment just needs to connect much more. I mean, it is connected, but people need to make that connection really. And I think having solutions that work for, for example, if you're working in a marine environment and the pressures are coming from upstream, whether that's from pollution or whether that's whatever it might be, it's really important to understand the whole scape and to handle issues within all of that. And I think Mark mentioned it really, the wheels to wave. I think that's an example of exactly that, going from the coastline, from the hinterland through the kind of riverine areas to the estuaries to the sea. I think it's just critical.
Thank you, David. Our next question is, how have you experienced legislation being on the back foot with nature-based solutions? What can you suggest to practitioners within government policy arm's length bodies to increase confidence with taking risks on new innovation and BS?
This is a really difficult area again in terms of getting governments to sort of change and take some of these risks. I think the more that we can evidence, I think in terms of change and improvement, that will be the force for doing things. I think as we were talking about earlier, I think, ground truthing a lot of what we are doing is going to be really important to say, and I feel that we're still, I think I said it in my final slide, that actually we still have a huge amount to learn in this area. And I think it's really important as a community, we recognize that we don't have all the answers, but as you said, we need the opportunity to get on and do some of these things. I think somebody else mentioned about the need to think holistically as well and be more joined up. And this is really about just creating the right sort of conversations and trying to get it has to work at all levels, has to work at the national level, at the local level. And I think we're getting some of that, but I think, we have to try and engage. And I said it earlier, we haven't even got our own community map set up of how we as professionals talk to each other around many of these issues. So here we are on this sort of particular conference call doing exactly that. But we're not best placed to do a lot of that. And I think we need to do better. So there are ways, but I think it's about getting those conversations going. And I said it needs to happen, I think, at all levels. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. And we've got plenty more questions, but I think, unfortunately, we will have to wrap up this discussion now. But of course, there's plenty that could be discussed. It's such an interesting, in-depth topic. So I'd like to thank our fantastic speakers for their time and their valuable insights in this discussion. I'd also like to thank our attendees for their questions, which the remaining questions can be answered by our expert panelists. I'm sure they'll get back to you. Thank you so much for this. And we've covered quite a lot. We've covered key barriers in implementing solutions for nature and climate. We've looked at strategies to ensure local communities are involved. We've looked at ways to shift from siloed approach. We've looked at policy, mechanisms, all of that. And once again, I'd like to thank you all for watching this and our speakers, Alison, Linsey, David, and Mark. Good afternoon. And now I'll be handing back to Ethne.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And just to echo you, Ax, a massive thank you to our speakers for their insightful presentations. That was really interesting. And to all of you for attending and taking part. And of course to you as well, Ax, for your brilliant chairing.
Thank you.
Just to let everyone know that this event has been recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel and the IES website. If you are a member of the IES and you're watching today, don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar on the members area of our website where you can use the CPD tool. If you're not a member of the IES, please do consider joining and taking your professional development to the next level. Thank you once again for attending. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.